In my dreams, I'm beautiful and bad. Two friends coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep.
For over 35 years now, Freddy Kreuger has been haunting the dreams of horror moviegoers and little kids alike. He's clawed his way into the echelon of scary movie baddies and gained a permanent spot with the likes of Michael, Jason, Chucky, Leatherface, Candyman, and Ghostface. Hopefully we're not forgetting anyone. For me, this nightmare all started in 2003 with Freddy vs. Jason. My friend and I had heard it was coming out, and we decided to properly prepare by watching all the Elm Street and Friday the 13th movies we could get our hands on. Mind you, this was back when you had to rely on your local video store and their indiscriminate collection of horror VHS. There was no ease of Netflix menus to scroll through, complete box sets, or torrents to download. When we finally saw Freddy vs. Jason, we had at least seen the good ones, or at least the more necessary ones. Since then, I've watched them all more than a few times, and some more than I'd care to admit. But how exactly did Freddy get here? With 3 decades of terror consisting of 7 movies, 1 badass cinematic crossover, and a remake, there's gotta be one hell of a story, right? The nightmare starts in 1984 with the first movie aptly titled A Nightmare on Elm Street. Director Wes Craven read a series of articles in the LA Times about Asian Rim refugees who, after arriving in the US, refused to go to sleep after suffering disturbing nightmares. Several of these refugees died in their sleep soon after. When they were found, it was discovered that they had hidden their prescribed sleeping pills in the mattress and used a Mr. Coffee with a hidden extension cord to make coffee to drink in an attempt to stay awake. Craven thought these events were straight out of a movie and drew inspiration to create a story where teens were dying in their nightmares at the hands of a terrifying boogeyman. This nightmare boogeyman is Freddy Kreuger. Out of all the silver screen killers, he's the funny one. A cat playing with his mouse victims. He says a lot of nasty shit no one else would.
Wanna suck the face?
No.
Okay, maybe Chucky would.
It ain't the size that counts, asshole. It's what you do with it.
Craven based Kreuger on the archetype of the dirty old man, a nasty parental figure who, instead of wanting and helping children to prosper, wants to see them destroyed. And he gets them in a unique way, where they're most vulnerable, when they're sleeping. What's worse than a nightmare? One that can kill you. Freddy made sleeping scary the same way the shark in Jaws made swimming scary. Craven named his dream killer after a kid who bullied him when he was younger, Fred Kreuger, and he donned him in a red and green sweater, as those are the most clashing colors to the human retina. In order to emulate the contemporary on-screen killers of the same era who wore masks but were mostly silent, Craven gave Kreuger a horribly burned face so he could still be scary to look at, but also make it easier to taunt and threaten his victims. This look was based on pepperoni pizza. Gross. Craven played with having Freddy wield a scythe to avoid using the common slasher weapon of a knife. Craven started thinking deep and asked himself, what's the oldest weapon man would have been afraid of? He landed on animal teeth and claws, and eventually gave the idea of a glove with steak knives to his effects guy Jim Doyle, and that's where the iconic glove was born. Craven wrote the screenplay in 1981, and after 3 years of being passed over by a number of studios in Hollywood, the budding new studio New Line Cinema finally picked up the movie. Although New Line is a powerhouse now, Nightmare was their first big commercial hit, and the studio is now often referred to as the house that Freddy built. When it came time to cast Kreuger, David Warner and even Kane Hodder, who would go on to play another iconic movie slasher Jason Voorhees, were considered for the role. But Craven wanted to cast an actor as opposed to a stunt performer. He found his man in Robert Englund, who, while not as physically intimidating as other actors, Craven said understood Freddy and brought a certain physicality to the role. Heather Langenkamp was cast as Nancy, beating out the likes of 80 stars like Demi Moore, Courtney Cox, Tracy Gold, and Jennifer Grey. Nancy is a different type of female lead, and Langenkamp brought much of herself to this last survivor.
Where's your pass? Screw your pass.
Langenkamp would end up returning to the series 2 more times, but we'll get to those. The film also stars Amanda Weiss as Tina, John Saxon as Lieutenant Thompson, and of course introduces Johnny Depp in his first feature film role. Charlie Sheen was up for the role but apparently wanted too much money. It was actually Craven's daughter who eventually convinced him to cast Depp as Glenn. Craven thought he was sickly and pale, but she thought he was beautiful. And she was right. Bringing a wholesome and sensitive edge to the performance, he got the role. Aiming for more of a psychologically damaging movie than a jump-scare thriller, Craven created a story that really gets under your skin. A story about the sins of the parents that comes with questions about the morality of vigilante justice. And he put it in Americans' backyards, Elm Street.
Every town has an Elm Street.
Nancy and all her friends start having nightmares about Freddy Kreuger and eventually realize that they are all having the same nightmare. They all brush it off as a coincidence before Tina is brutally murdered during a sleepover. Her death scene is one of the most memorable in the entire series, and the way they made it was even better. Taken from a Fred Astaire gag, a rotated set was used to great effect. In fact, a lot of awesome effects went into the making of this movie. The bathtub Nancy falls asleep in had no bottom and a giant tank underneath. The same rotating room was used for Glenn's death scene, and damn, this one still haunts me. While it may seem archaic now, the old school ways of shooting with marionette effects, shots in reverse, and rotating sets proved terrifying to audiences. In the end, Nancy takes away Freddy's power by taking away the fear he had imposed on Elm Street, which is a pretty powerful ending statement. Until it's not. Another ending seems oddly tacked onto this ending and delivers sort of a weird and unclear finale. Wes Craven wanted a happier toned ending with Nancy walking off into a bright and sunny day, but as we know, the killer always has to come back for one last scare.
This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
Producer Bob Shaye wanted one last hook, and more importantly, a chance of a sequel. Wes Craven considered Shaye so integral to actually getting the movie made that he gave him his hook. But it was Craven's idea to have the little girls singing the iconic rhyme at the end. After getting turned down by distributor after distributor, New Line bet on themselves and released it on their own. This was a gamble that could have ruined the company, but the movie blew audiences away. It launched the careers of Craven, Englund, Depp, and of course, the franchise as we know it. A Nightmare on Elm Street was New Line's first real taste of success, and they knew they absolutely had to make a sequel. And that sequel is contentious to say the least. Wes Craven was reportedly offered the chance to direct another Nightmare, but he didn't really want to make another one, as having sold the rights away to get the first one made in the first place, he didn't want to work on something someone else owned. He thought the new script ideas were inferior anyway. Wanting to write a story about possession and take the sequel in a new direction, the original concept was written by Leslie Baum, involving an idea about Freddy getting inside a mother's womb and controlling the fetus. A New Line executive was pregnant at the time, so they pretty much passed on that idea. This pregnancy idea would eventually be used down the line for Nightmare 5, but we'll get to that. This time around, the film follows Jesse Walsh, a teenager who begins having recurring nightmares about Freddy Kreuger after moving into the former home of Nancy Thompson. The film stars Mark Patton as Jesse, Robert Rissler as Ron, and Meryl Streep as Lisa. Mark Patton actually auditioned for Part 1 and had a certain on-screen vulnerability to beat out the likes of Brad Pitt and Christian Slater for Part 2. You know, it's funny. This movie actually started without Robert Englund, if you can believe it. Producer Bob Shaye thought he could save some money by casting some unknown extra in the role. But when the guy was cast, they found that he didn't capture the same gait and performance that Englund had, though he did manage to actually remain in the movie in one scene. I mean, just look how this guy just shuffles around in the shower scene versus how Englund stalks his prey in the first one. At least they came to their senses on that one. I gotta give my honest opinion here. This movie fucking sucks. I mean, it's just a weird movie. It seems like this movie was made in a rush with no love behind it. Some effects are pretty great, like when Freddy tears his way out of Jesse near the end. Every cut seems like a new effect, and this whole scene is an awesome achievement. But some effects are very much not an achievement. This whole scene about the demonic parakeet is one of the many reasons Wes Craven thought the script was inferior. And these devil dogs, just damn. Hilarious. Another thing Craven didn't really care for was the scene where Freddy attacks a bunch of teenagers at a pool party. And I kinda have to agree with this here. Craven stated that Freddy being out in the real world diminishes his scare factor, which it did. When the Dream Master is out in the open and half the people there are bigger than him, it's questionable at least. Now the part you might have been waiting for. When I watched this movie with my friend in preparation for Freddy vs. Jason, we knew something was weird about this movie, but we couldn't quite put our finger on it. There was just something funny about it. Watching it as an adult, it doesn't take 5 minutes to realize there is a lot of gay subtext going on, if you can even call it subtext. Just take a look at a few of these scenes.
Heads up, play, Brady. Something is trying to get inside my body.
Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me.
One of the most important things to note about this movie is how wildly different it is not only from the rest of the series, but from the horror genre in general. Typically, horror movies follow a formula that includes a strong final girl and terrifying physical scenes. And while the original Nightmare featured believable teenage characters, a strong final girl, and a terrifying Freddy, this sequel has characters with barely any arc and a weak final boy. There's a lot of debate over the intention behind the portrayal of Jesse's character that I'll get into later, but for now, let's just look at the character himself. Jesse is a teenage boy who's had the misfortune of moving into 1428 Elm Street. The film opens with his nightmare, which his parents, surprise surprise, don't take seriously. Jesse befriends Lisa and Rod, and the movie is off. Typical horror, right? Not quite. It may be more accepted now, but we don't typically think of the lead of a horror movie as the boy. It's almost always the girl being terrorized and sexually abused by the killer.
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
Here, Freddy is literally trying to inhabit Jesse's body.
You've got the body.
I don't know how much more pointed you can get. As an allegory for trying to hide in the closet, it works really well.
Jesse, fight him!
I can't!
For a Freddy movie, it just comes across as downright bizarre. The producer and writer denied the presence of any gay storyline in the film.
I mean, I never wrote, he screams like a woman, you know what I mean?
They've changed their tune about this since, but at least when the film first released, they maintained that Jesse was playing it straight. Freddy's Revenge is now hailed as the first gay horror film and has secured a spot in LGBTQ cinema.
This movie is the gayest thing.
That's true.
And we did Xanadu last month.
That's true.
But you don't have to take my word for it. Just check out this great documentary called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street that can tell you all about it a lot better than I can. It stars Mark Patton and tells of his experience with the movie and its effect on his entire life. Despite some seriously mixed reviews, most of them comparing it unfavorably to the original, the film sold out across the country. New Line now realized what they had on their hands. A franchise. Now this is a nightmare sequel. New Line knew that they had to do a lot better than the critical failure that was Freddy's Revenge, and in my opinion, they definitely pulled that off. Part 3 is almost the best one. Besides the original, it might actually be the best one. The directing duties were once again offered to Wes Craven. Craven wanted to take the franchise to the next level, but producers thought the script he and Bruce Wagner came up with was too ambitious. Although he had to bow out of directing Part 3 because he was busy directing Deadly Friend, whatever the fuck that is, he did get a writing credit. Frank Darabont was also brought on to do some writing. Chuck Russell ended up directing and co-writing, and he brought a more imaginative edge to the production. He brought in the idea that the kids should be a team working together against Freddy and brought back the threat of the authority figure that doesn't believe. This movie does something awesome as a sequel, especially as a horror sequel. They brought back the hero from the original. Bringing back Heather Langenkamp as Nancy let you know this movie was serious business. If there's one bad bitch who can beat Freddy at his own game, it's Nancy. Not only did this movie bring back the best character, it introduced a few new ones. Patricia Arquette in her feature film debut as Kristen Parker, Ken Sagoes as Kincaid, Rodney Eastman as Joey. Oh, and I guess Lawrence Fishburne was in this too, back when he was known as Larry. Also, John Saxon came back as Nancy's father. Does this guy fucking age? This time around, Nancy is all grown up, and she's a psychiatrist helping a group of kids at Weston Hills Mental Hospital who all say they're having recurring dreams of old you-know-who. Not you. New Line apparently wanted to get away from the disaster that was Part 2, and they rose to the occasion of a bigger budget and took this one a little more seriously. The effects alone are evidence of this. I mean, look at this shit, they got everything under the sun in this one. A giant worm monster that would become somewhat of a staple later on, this stop-motion marionette scene which leads to this awesome tendon effect, these awful track marks, this mirror hallway, a Ray Harryhausen skeleton, which is fucking awesome by the way, the first appearance of the children's souls on Freddy, and of course the famous television kill.
Fuck the prime time, bitch!
There's something to be said about practical effects. They'll always win. The movie really beefs up the ideas of the original, and sets the tone for the rest of the series with lavish sets and dream worlds. They really dove into giving Freddy one-liners that gave the movie a dash of black humor that stuck around too.
What's wrong, Joey? Feeling tongue-tied? What a rush.
Can I ask you something?
Certainly.
Who gives a fuck what you think?
In the end, Nancy goes out like a hero, which I feel is fitting for the character, but more importantly the series if it was going to continue. It's a little unexpected and a huge bummer to see Nancy go at the hands of Kreuger, but that's the point. If the main hero can die, it creates some suspense. Truly anything can happen. For all the Freddy buffs out there, this one is the first one to reference not only Weston Hills, but also Hypnosil. Things that returned to great appeal in Freddy vs. Jason. Dream Warriors was a return to everything we loved about the first film. Freddy is scary again, the deaths are brutal and graphic, and there's an important return to the Freddy mythology that the second movie really missed out on. Freddy is scary because he's out to get these kids for something their parents did. He's revenge from beyond the grave, and there's nothing these kids can do about it. The kids themselves are a high point of the film. The actors are talented and work together as a seamless team. Part of this is due to the environment they're in, which simultaneously cements their bond and demonstrates to the audience aspects of their personalities that we wouldn't get if they were out in the real world. This might be a way Dream Warriors is actually superior to the original. In the first movie, the teens seem real, but we don't get to know them as well as the Dream Warriors. And as a huge bonus, this tight-knit group gets the benefit of being led by Nancy herself. Nancy believes the kids because she went through this herself. She is the antithesis of the typical horror movie adult, and the kids come to depend on her for survival. Nancy toes the line between child and adult, often having to go to bat for the kids against her colleagues because of her beliefs. The connection to the first movie with Nancy, coupled with the new cast of fresh faces, created a powerhouse of a horror movie. I can't not mention that this movie also comes with its very own music video. The band Dokken created a theme song called Dream Warriors for the film. Now, I don't know who the fuck Dokken is except for this movie, but their music video is hilarious and definitely worth a watch. If only because the band members themselves take so much pride in it. Anyway, this movie ended up making a shitload of money. The series had officially moved on from little indie surprise to full-on blockbuster. It was the first New Line film to release internationally, and it's still the third highest grossing in the series after Freddy vs. Jason and Part 4. Speaking of, a year after the events of Dream Warriors, Freddy Kreuger reappears in the dreams of Kristen Parker, Joey Crussell, and Roland Kincaid. After completing his revenge against the families who killed him, Kreuger uses Kristen's best friend Alice Johnson to gain access to new victims in order to sate his murderous needs. The bigger sequel that was Part 3 meant a bigger audience, and the series had now gone farther than ever thought possible. It had a reputation, and now so did New Line. For Part 4, New Line wanted another new, young, hot director, which had proved fortuitous for them before, but more importantly, proved cheap. Rennie Harlin, who had just come off of directing Prison, was interviewed, but producer Bob Shea didn't like the fact that being from Finland, he could barely speak English. Harlan, though, really pushed it and just kept showing up at New Line and hanging out in their lobby and showing up at Shea's office. Apparently, his pushing has paid off, and he won them over and they let him direct. One thing the producers liked about him was that he understood youth culture, as he was fairly young himself at the time. Due to the untimely 1988 Writers Guild of America strike, Harlan was forced to improvise a lot during the filming. The script they had was basically a rough treatment at the time, and they just had to go with what they had. Coming into a series that had now been around for a whole trilogy, Harlan felt it was best to reinvent the series. He saw Freddy as the James Bond of horror and wanted him even more in the spotlight than before. He cast Lisa Wilcox as Alice Johnson, Danny Hassel as Danny Jordan, Toy Newkirk as Sheila, and Andrus Jones as Christian Slater. Rodney Eastman and Ken Sagaz also reprised their roles as Joey and Kincaid from Part 3. Unfortunately, the production couldn't get Patricia Arquette, who had blown up between movies. So, Tuesday Knight stepped in as Kristen. While she does a fine job as Kristen, there is an obvious disconnect between the actors. But it's not that big a deal, because the final Elm Street kids are wiped out pretty quickly anyway.
Now, no one sleeps!
This could be because I saw this movie right after 3 and well after it had come out, but killing them off seemed a little cheap. Why build them up at all if they are going to be summarily taken out so easily in the next one? I hate when horror movies do that. Over 600 actresses auditioned for the role of Alice, which was eventually given to Lisa Wilcox. Wilcox had actually auditioned for a role in the previous film, Dream Warriors, but failed to land it. Director Rennie Harlin describes that he and the producers were looking for somebody they could make seem timid and vulnerable in the beginning, and then in a believable way become kind of like Sigourney Weaver in Alien. This one has some memorable scenes like the palm tree scene where Freddy does a shark gag and wears sunglasses for some reason, and there are cool effects like Kincaid stuck in the junkyard, the Terminator hand coming through the desk, the nightmare elevator, the movie theater scene where characters transform from 3D to 2D, this pizza scene, Freddy's chest of souls, and the cockroach hotel scene is probably the best part, containing some pretty stunning effects. Very visceral. There's also a cool time loop scene which Robert Englund said is his favorite sequence despite not even being in it. While this one is hailed by fans as being a pretty good entry in the series, I feel it does have some oddities that prevent it from being one of the best nightmares. Right off the bat, Freddy is brought back by a dog pissing on his grave, which is cool? I don't know. Some people say it's tied to some mythical animal-to-animal thing, like some sort of hell beast resurrecting Freddy, but is it really? There's a pretty funny invisible Freddy scene where the production reportedly ran out of money. Rick Johnson was originally slated to die in a Freddy-induced elevator accident in the dream world, but it was all rewritten into a scene where Christian has to fight an invisible Freddy using kung fu in a hastily put-together dojo.
You think that's air you're breathing now?
At the box office, Freddy 4 killed it once again, and Rennie Harlin ended up becoming fairly accomplished, going on to direct movies like Die Hard 2, Cliffhanger, and Deep Blue Sea. Nightmare had officially entered the lexicon of American pop culture. Other horror movies were copying it. There were t-shirts, action figures, Freddy gloves, masks, a Freddy doll, watches, bed sheets, a pinball machine, an album with music videos, and oddly enough, kids' toys, which is interesting to think about since Freddy started out as a child molester. Freddy even had a 900 number and a TV show.
Merchandising.
Freddy had officially taken over, and New Line had to keep the nightmare going. Nightmare on Elm Street was now a massive commodity. Fearing that Freddy was turning into a game show host type, which let's be honest, he was, New Line was aiming to make Freddy a little more serious again. This time around, the producers decided to get deep into the origins, while simultaneously adding to Freddy's family tree. After meeting with a myriad of writers, all who had vastly different ideas for a sequel, New Line contacted writer Leslie Boehm, who had unsuccessfully pitched an idea for Nightmare Part 3 involving Freddy having a child. This time around, they liked his idea of Freddy becoming a father.
It's a boy!
New Line started looking for their usual want in a director, someone up and coming and hungry to bring something new to the series. They eventually landed on English director Stephen Hopkins, who from what I can tell, the best thing at the time was being a second unit director on Highlander. Good for him. For Freddy's smorgasbord of teen slaughter, they brought back Lisa Wilcox as Alice, Danny Hassel as Danny, newcomer Kelly Jo Minter played Yvonne, Joe Seeley as Mark, and Erica Anderson as Greta. For Freddy's son Jacob, everyone's favorite Velociraptor hater Whitby Hedford was brought on. This film opens with a flashback of where Freddy came from. I'm not sure how to go about saying this, so I'm just going to say it. Freddy is the spawn of 1,000 maniacs raping a nun. Nightmare on Elm Street isn't exactly known for subtle horror, but that's pretty fucked up. You know, I can't think of a better origin story, actually. It's just fucked up enough to be worthy of Freddy. It's a storyline we haven't seen, but it doesn't lose any of Nightmare's trademark grit. What they also gave Freddy is a backstory. Sometimes this can be a big no-no for horror series, and often considered unnecessary or even unwanted. But as it's all told in expositional backstory, it's not so bad. Freddy is the, quote, bastard son of 100 maniacs. If we have to know where Freddy came from when he was human, this will certainly do. Along with the Freddy origin, this movie comes with the usual impressive display of effects. And being one of the final slashers of the 80s, they are definitely worth mentioning. We've got Freddy's birth, the lavish sets, the motorcycle scene, this disgusting scene, this stop-motion pool scene, and of course, the memorable comic book scene, which was actually sets painted in black and white and not footage changed in post. While they didn't have an ending in mind before shooting, I think they pulled this MC Escher-inspired spectacle off pretty well. In the end though, even the director knew you can't kill Freddy, and his ending is a little ambiguous. This movie does have echoes of Dream Warriors in it, with a ragtag group of teens who each bring a unique personality to the story. But there's some serious overlap with the series. 5 is better than Part 4 for sure, but when I think back on them, their similarities kind of make them run together in my mind. With the same heroine, the token black girl, and generally the same aesthetic, Nightmare had reached an unfortunate space where it was being remembered for certain kill gags instead of the plot. It's hard to tell the difference between them sometimes. So instead of Part 4 being about Freddy reviving himself through Alice, or Part 5 being about his son, they become the one with the Roach Motel or the one with the killer motorcycle, for example. Having come out less than a year after Part 4, the film was reaching the point every major horror franchise reaches and was starting to feel a little overexposed. It received mostly negative reviews and is the lowest grossing Nightmare sequel, but I dig it. I realized on my watch through for this video that there's debatably a Star Trek thing going on here, in which all the odd-numbered Freddy movies are good, and the other ones leave more to be desired.
It's a fact. Sure as day follows night, sure as eggs is eggs, sure as every odd-numbered Star Trek movie is shit.
But that's just my opinion, man. After the disappointing reception of The Dream Child, New Line knew it was time to put Freddy to rest. They wanted to go out with a bang, so they sold Part 6 as the final Freddy film, and they actually meant it. Peter Jackson actually wrote a draft for a script called The Dream Lover, involving an old decrepit Freddy that no one is scared of anymore. Kids actually put themselves to sleep to go mess with him in the dream world. Ultimately, Jackson didn't get the job, but he laid the foundation at New Line for something even better. In the end, Michael DeLuca went out with Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Rachel Talalay got her chance to direct, which was really something special since she had been producing the series since the beginning. The movie starred Sean Greenblatt playing John Doe, who may or may not be Freddy's son, Ricky Dean Logan as Carlos, Leslie Dean as Tracy, Breckin Meyer as Spencer, Lisa Zane as the rare trusting adult Maggie, and they even had Alien and 007 alumni Yaphet Kotto. There were also a number of cameos in the final chapter. Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold showed up as they were apparently fans of the series. Johnny Depp returned in a small cameo.
This is your brain on drugs.
But the one the crew were most excited about was Alice Cooper, playing Freddy Kreuger's father.
You ready for it, boy?
This one leans a little more toward humor, being influenced by Twin Peaks, which was airing at the time, and the usual effects were present.
We're in Twin Peaks here.
Definitely.
And the last 10 minutes of the film were even shot in 3D. While it may look like shit now, the technology was brand new and apparently very difficult to shoot at the time. These little Freddy demons were also some of the first instances of CGI. This film kind of tramples on Freddy canon set up in other films. There, we knew Freddy as an isolated janitor who lured children to the school basement. Here, this film tries to rewrite Freddy as a married family man with a daughter who he adores. And it just doesn't work. It's technically the third time we've seen this franchise try to shed some light on Freddy's background, and this one is such a different take that it really removes the audience from the film. It's jarring and not in a good way. It creates unnecessary confusion and feels tired even though it's a new version. The characters are uninteresting and barely likable, and the CGI itself is a big departure from the tangible dream worlds of previous films. It starts out okay with a great creepy atmosphere with the world without kids, but then doesn't really deliver in the end. It did deliver at the box office though. It was number 1 on opening weekend and earned the highest opening weekend in the series until Freddy vs. Jason, despite negative reviews.
Now I'm playing with power!
This was in part thanks to it being pushed as the final chapter and due to some clever marketing. New Line actually held a fake funeral for Freddy at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where the press showed up to promote it with cast from across the series. It seemed Freddy really was dead, until 3 years later when a certain someone felt the need to return to the series to properly lay it to rest. Freddy had now been slashing up the silver screen for 10 years, and Wes Craven felt he wanted one more shot. Even if his biggest problem was Freddy being officially 6 feet under, Craven struggled with making a new original sequel. After 10 years, he wanted to change the fact that Freddy Kreuger and the Nightmare films followed him wherever he went in his life and career, and wanted to change how that looked. He wanted to go another route, and in true Craven fashion, he decided on something somewhat unheard of at the time, something that would break the continuity of the franchise. He decided to get meta. He decided if he couldn't do something fresh in the movies, he would portray Freddy Kreuger as a fictional movie villain who invades the real world and haunts the cast and crew responsible for his films. Now, Freddy could not only haunt you in the movies, he could haunt you in real life too. This idea was very unique at the time and very ahead of its time. Heather Langenkamp plays herself, Robert Englund plays himself, and even John Saxon. Hold on, what? Alright, seriously, this guy looks like he did in part 1. This guy just does not fucking age!
Come on.
Lynn Shay, who has made a nice little horror career of her own since, came back for a cameo. There's a few new faces too, with Tracy Middendorf, David Newsom, Fran Bennett, and Miko Hughes plays Heather's real-life son. If this kid looks familiar, let me save you a Google search. He was in Pet Sematary. They even had a scene involving a funeral in which a lot of Nightmare alumni showed up. This time around, Freddy gets a makeover and is depicted as closer to what Craven originally intended, being much more menacing and much less comical with an updated attire and appearance. This is supposed to be the real Freddy after all.
Miss me?
Being a more modern movie with a seasoned director, the look of the film gets an update too. The rotating room came back, this highway scene with projected backgrounds, this awesome tongue gag. Just look at these sets. While there were cool effects, it's the story that really shines. While other films in the series attempted to make Freddy a serious villain, this is the movie that does it best. It really is what sets this one apart from not only the Nightmare series, but horror in general. It made the leap from a tired franchise from the 80s to a fresh take on what would become 90s horror with the likes of I Know What You Did Last Summer, Scream, Urban Legend, Idle Hands, and H20. Craven had always pushed the boundaries of reality in his films. With this one, he threw out all the rules and made it self-aware. It was a huge risk and it paid off incredibly well. Having not only Heather play herself, but Englund and even Craven come in to play real versions of their fictional self was an absolutely brilliant move. This is especially shown through Dylan, who has to contend with Freddy in his nightmares and in the real world. This film achieved what the second movie tried to do. It made Freddy real. But unlike the second one, it didn't take a crap on the legacy. New Nightmare was hailed by critics for its true originality, but it didn't perform that great at the box office. It made its money back, but it's surprisingly the lowest performing Nightmare film. All that aside though, it was a great finale for the series and the true ending in many fans' eyes. And hey, Craven's ingenuity with meta-horror storytelling brought us a brand new series that stands tall among its predecessors. Finally, the horror legend was put to rest one last time.
What about Freddy vs. Jason?
Enter fellow horror titan, Jason Voorhees. This one had been in the can for a long time. Inspired by monster movies from the 1930s and 40s like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, the time had finally come for two of the most iconic horror villains in film to go head to head. It took a while to pull off because Paramount held the rights to Jason Voorhees and they were understandably cautious about lending him out to New Line. In its time in development hell, there were many considerations for this movie. Ash Williams was considered to go against the duo, and there was even an original ending involving Pinhead from Hellraiser considered. In the end, a deal was worked out, and we got the showdown we'd all been waiting for. And the film was great. It turned out well because they let Freddy do his thing, and they let Jason do his. They let Freddy be the psychological tormentor, and they let Jason be the force of nature that he is. And this unstoppable force and this immovable object work quite well together. The characters are different enough so that their fight is interesting. Like imagine if Michael Myers took Jason on. It would have been 2 hours of them silently lumbering after each other, ending in a silent knife fight. They even have an interesting origin discussion about Freddy being born of fire and Jason being born of water.
Freddy died by fire, Jason by water. How can we use that?
If you can call dying being born. The franchises both have the same demographic, but the reason this is one of the best versus movies of all time is the way the movie seamlessly weaves both characters and their backstories in such an effortless way. Freddy recruits Jason to start killing for him and raise the fear on Elm Street again, but when Jason starts beating Freddy to the punch when killing, they become adversaries. Simple enough, right? The movie incorporates classic locations from each. Weston Hill and Camp Crystal Lake are both featured, and more importantly, gives each lore equal attention. And it's not like these are two separate stories. Both characters exist within the other's universe perfectly naturally. Freddy expertly taunts Jason as his own mother, and the characters dovetail perfectly into each other's stories. Ronnie Yu, the director of Bride of Chucky, was tapped to direct. He didn't want to at first, as he didn't consider himself as a fan of either franchise, but that's exactly what Bob Shea was looking for. Someone with a new angle. Kane Hodder was oddly not offered to take on the role of Jason Voorhees. This upset a lot of people since Hodder was at the time considered the quintessential and pretty much official actor to portray Jason. But producers wanted someone taller and bulkier to contrast the smaller, lankier Freddy. Monica Keena played Laurie, Brendan Fletcher as Mark, Jason Ritter as Will, Zach Ward as Bobby, Kelly Rowland as Kia, Chris Marquette as Charlie, and Jason Mewes as Freeberg. And the characters are actually interesting this time around. And check out these kills. When Freddy and Jason finally go head-to-head at the end, this movie fucking delivers. It's an almost WWE-inspired all-out brawl. Jason smashes Freddy into walls, Freddy bashes Jason with pipes, and their melee ends in a giant explosion. It definitely goes over the top, but what the fuck else would you want? Who wins, though? It's a bit debatable and sort of depends on who you're a bigger fan of. Jason does decapitate Freddy, but you can't really keep this guy down. We'll call it a draw. This one turned out to be the highest grossing entry in both franchises. And kinda like Freddy's Dead, there was a press conference held in Las Vegas. Check this shit out.
Mama's boy here, he's big, he's dumb, he's slow, he's stupid, and he ain't got no style!
Since then, we haven't seen much of Freddy Kreuger. It's not news to say that Hollywood has run out of slasher ideas and has been concentrating on remakes these days. Even Kreuger himself has been victim of that. Perhaps that's best for now, though. There are plenty of original horror films coming out, and if you think about it, Freddy got pretty far without getting too overdone. The Nightmare franchise has been a little more conservative compared to some of the other horror franchises that started out in the 80s. Freddy is unique in his ability to haunt your dreams, and at least to slasher fans, he'll always be there, lurking in our slumber. Sweet dreams.